Today I want to take a look at The Wolf Among Us 2. I want to explore the story, some theories, and everything that we currently know before the game releases. This is built obviously from trailers and promotional images and interviews from Telltale game, and the most recent stuff actually that just came out. So before we get into that, obviously I think it's worth briefly, and I mean very briefly, revisiting the events of The Wolf Among Us Season 1. What ended up happening in Season 1 was we follow Sheriff Bigby Wolf as he investigates the murders of Faith and Lily. What begins as a straightforward murder case quickly unfolds into something much larger, revealing a hidden criminal network operating beneath Fabletown. As Bigby digs deeper, he discovers that many Fables are being exploited through illegal glamour operations controlled by the Crooked Man. Now, initially, everyone thought that Ichabod Crane was to blame, but it's revealed that the murders were carried out by Georgie Porgy under the Crooked Man's orders. And after confronting Bloody Mary and dismantling the Crooked Man's operation, Bigby is left with one final unresolved thread. Now, this one involved Faith and Nerissa. The mystery, however, is never fully explained, leaving an open-ended narrative. Now, with the recap over, we can now move into The Wolf Among Us 2. And this story, once again, is from everything that we've seen so far and what I've been able to piece together. If you don't like something, if you think something is wrong, please let me know down in the comments so we can fix that and talk about it a little bit more. At some point, a homicide detective named Fei Long contacts Bigby regarding a series of 6 murders. The victims include a husband and a wife who are discovered brutally killed and shredded to pieces. This suggests that something extremely violent and deliberate is occurring rather than just a random murder. Now, early suspicion begins to form around a group known as the Oz Gang. This crew is led by Dorothy Gale and includes members such as the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, and Scarecrow. From here, Bigby is pulled into a larger conspiracy, one that threatens the already fragile peace among the exiled Fables. As he investigates deeper, he is betrayed, framed, and ultimately exiled himself, forcing him to operate from the shadows, while Fabletown descends further into corruption, fear, and revenge than ever before. And now, with Bigby removed from the picture, the Oz Gang rises in influence. Under Dorothy Gale's leadership, Dorothy is portrayed as a highly intelligent and dangerous individual. However, she is also unstable, suffering from delusions of grandeur. She is skilled in hand-to-hand combat, infiltration, espionage, and notably refused Fabletown's offer of amnesty in exchange for a clean slate. Now, the crimes that she committed include premeditated murder, kidnapping, manslaughter, and treason. Among her gang is the Tin Man, who is a volatile and emotionally unstable figure. He is obsessive, irrational, and highly reactive with a clear addictive personality. His crimes include robbery, kidnapping, and murder. Now, another member is the Cowardly Lion. He is highly anxious and easily intimidated, with strong fears of loud noises, open spaces, thunder, and large crowds. However, when pushed into a corner, he becomes extremely violent and unpredictable. Now, the final member of the group is Scarecrow, but very little is known about him at this stage. So at this point, Bigby has been framed for a crime he did not commit. Someone has lied to Snow White about him, leading to his forced exile from Fabletown and from his sheriff duties. The 13th floor is also implicated in this larger conspiracy. They were mentioned in Season 1, but they were never really seen. They weren't really realized. And they are an organization of witches and wizards responsible for creating glamours for all of the Fables. Now, they live on the 13th floor, and that's more of a secretive kind of floor that is very hard to get access to. Now, Bluebeard also appears to be tied into this conspiracy. I think the evidence suggests that he may be involved behind the scenes doing something, as he's wanted Bigby out of the sheriff picture for a very long time. And I think he wants to get Bigby away from Snow White, and this way, whatever he did, whatever, conspiracy he's involved in, actually pushes that narrative that he wants. So this situation is made worse by the fact that Bigby was already on thin ice with Snow and the rest of Fabletown after a confrontation with the Oz Gang, and he was ordered to go to therapy by Snow White due to concerns over his increasingly violent behavior. With that context in place, attention returns to the 6 murders. It now appears that the bodies may have been transported into New York City. It is unclear whether the killings took place in Fabletown itself or if the victims were murdered elsewhere and moved across the city, because there's a reason that New York City and Fabletown are kind of tied together in this particular narrative. So a new detective the one that we talked about earlier, Faye, takes over this case, or she is given this case, and she is very green, she is very new. Again, her name is Faye Long, and she begins to dig deeper. But something about the investigation feels off. Something about these murders feels off. The evidence doesn't necessarily line up, and the pattern behind the murder suggests that something bigger is at play. So this actually leads her to reaching out to Bigby Wolf. How does she know who he is? How does she get in contact with him? That I do not know, but she does reach out, and the two begin to work together. Through Bigby, Faye is pulled into the hidden world of fables for the first time, and she is kind of forced to confront the reality behind Fabletown and this big system that is occurring right in the middle of New York, right? Without anybody else knowing. So together they begin uncovering this huge conspiracy that has been operating in the shadows, quietly influencing events and keeping the truth buried, whatever it is. However, it becomes clear that neither the Oz Gang nor Bluebeard are the true masterminds behind everything. There is another force at work, something far more powerful, more controlled, and more dangerous, a presence that seems to be pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And this is why I don't believe this is just another case for Sheriff Bigby like the one in season 1. This is something far larger than anything he has ever faced before. Now, I also think that there's a strong possibility that the true threat could come from a witch or a wizard tied to the 13th floor. Someone who has either gone rogue, become violent, or is pursuing greater power. That direction would be really interesting to explore. One of the biggest takeaways from The Wolf Among Us 2, based on promotional material and the official website, is Bigby Wolf's character arc. Now, in particular, one line stands out from the website over at Telltale. Will the monster within threaten to destroy everything he's trying to protect, or be the key to its salvation? That is a beautiful line. And that line captures, I think, maybe the conflict going on within the entire game. It reflects a struggle that Sheriff Bigby has been dealing with since season 1 and maybe before that. Here it feels like it's the main focus. While in season 1 it was kind of a conversation, but this is the main focus. It raises, I think, a massive question. Can Bigby control the monster that's inside of him, the big bad wolf, or does he need to embrace it? Like, this is fucking cool. This is like Spider-Man or something, right? I have to be Spider-Man to save the world. So it's like, does he have to be the big bad wolf to save Fabletown? Like, I don't know. It's really fucking cool. So anyways, season 1 explored whether Bigby could escape his past and distance himself from his reputation as a feared monster in Fabletown. And that was something that I personally took to heart in the first season. I really wanted Bigby to kind of change his ways. Now, season 2 seems to flip that idea a little bit. Instead of focusing only on maybe the restraint, and it questions whether Bigby may need to accept that darker side of himself again. Possibly even use it to confront a threat far worse than anything he's ever faced before. The threat of season 2. Now, I think all of this is kind of teased in the trailers, right? We see him going to the anger management, we see him going to therapy, and he's trying to control himself, but at the same time we see him transform into the big bad wolf. So this is an internal conflict that Bigby is dealing with, and I think it's becoming harder and harder to suppress. I think the tension between maybe controlling it and the instinct to, become what you need to become to save Fabletown opens up a shit ton of potential for Bigby's development. I mean, we are going to see a huge character arc, I think, for him. I'm really excited to see where his character could end up. Now, if we take a closer look at the investigation board shown in the trailer, we can find a lot of details that support what we've discussed so far. Several notes directly reference key story elements, including the fact that somebody lied to Snow White, the involvement of the 13th floor, and even the fate of Ichabod Crane. One of the more interesting details concerns Crane himself. At the end of season 1, he is exiled from Fabletown and effectively told to never return. We know he was given a one-way ticket to France, and according to the information on the board, that's where he ended up. The question is whether Crane will actually play a role in The Wolf Among Us 2. Will he return? Is he connected to the conspiracy? Personally, I don't think so, and I honestly hope he isn't. I hated Ichabod Crane. I think that was his point. I absolutely despised him, but I think maybe this is Telltale kind of answering a question from season 1 and kind of connecting the two. Or maybe Ichabod Crane was murdered and his body was sent back to New York, you know what I mean? And that's why, or how he's involved. So I think with all that stuff kind of being said, I think the fact that his picture appears on the board is still worth paying some attention to. Now, if you look closely at the trailer, you can also see Bigby investigating several strange and seemingly ancient objects. One scene shows him interacting with a bookcase that opens up a hidden passage, allowing him to access an area that appears to have been concealed for a long time. Moments like that are one of the reasons that I think the 13th floor and its witches and its wizards could be far more important to the story than maybe we initially thought. There's also a scene where Bigby picks up a small object that looks kind of of like a bell. Whatever it is, it appears to be infused with some kind of dark magic or some magic in general. The object explodes and it sends Bigby, flying backward. My guess is that it takes place at one of the murder scenes and the object is tied to some kind of ritual. Another detail that stands out tremendously is this mysterious symbol connected to the killings. Based on what we've seen, the same symbol appears at multiple crime scenes, and this suggests that the murders are linked. The imagery of the rune or the symbol feels very dark, and it feels darker than anything we've ever seen in The Wolf Among Us. It gives us the impression that something far more sinister is happening behind the scenes. Now, what I think is interesting is that many of these clues can be found on the investigation board shown in the trailer. The board appears to connect the murders, the symbol, the 13th floor, and several other unanswered questions. Now, this gives us the clearest look yet at the mystery that Bigby is trying to solve. Now, let's take a deeper look at this symbol here. Now, it's actually a rune, and this, once again, is across multiple crime scenes. It's almost like the artist or the murderer kind of leaving a tag behind. What I think is interesting is that it doesn't belong to any known language. Bigby has access to resources and records that document countless languages and magical histories, as we can remember in The Wolf Among Us 1. However, nobody knows what this rune means. Apparently, it's an unknown language, and this raises an interesting possibility. Maybe this isn't a forgotten language at all. Maybe it was deliberately hidden, and that's honestly what I think. Perhaps someone used powerful magic to erase it from history or suppress knowledge of its existence, and I think that's one of the witches or the wizards. Whatever the case is, this rune feels like one of the most important clues in the entire story, in the entire investigation. Something else that stood out to me was the way that the murders are presented. The crime scenes aren't random acts of violence, they are carefully staged. The bodies are displayed in a deliberate and almost artistic manner, as if the killer wants them to be discovered. Whoever is responsible seems to take pride in their work, leaving behind scenes designed to send messages. And this is one of the main reasons that I actually don't believe that the Oz gang is the ultimate threat. They're dangerous, of course, they're psychotic, they're lunatic, but they don't strike me as a type to orchestrate something this elaborate. Their methods are more direct and brutal. The murders we're seeing involve planning, patience, and some sort of symbolism. Now, looking at the investigation board, it suggests that the Oz gang may have been contracts connected to, and they were hired to do some of these killings. It's possible that maybe they're just part of the bigger puzzle. They could be carrying out certain tasks while someone else higher up is pulling all of the strings. Maybe they're responsible for the killings, while another individual, the main culprit, is organizing and arranging the bodies and creating this kind of ritual around them. We can see that Detective Faye Long has been investigating several NYPD suspects that were likely part of her early attempts to solve the case, but she obviously ended up discovering more evidence pointing towards Fabletown and the hidden world of fables. So if we look at the lower right section of the board, there also appears to be a photograph of one of the crime scenes. Now, it's difficult to make out every detail, but it looks incredibly graphic. Whatever happened to these victims, Telltale doesn't seem to be pulling any punches with the darker tone of this story. I think another clue that caught my attention is a reference to a stolen dagger. Now, the writing is difficult to read, but the board suggests that this weapon may have been taken prior to the murders. My theory is that this dagger is magical in nature and could be connected to both the killings and the mysterious rune appearing at the crime scene. When you put all of these pieces together, it starts to feel like The Wolf Among Us 2 is building toward something that's going to take all of us by surprise. Right now, it seems like we're looking at a story centered around the hidden magic and someone operating in the background, kind of pulling all of the strings, like this big organization. And whatever this conspiracy is, it reaches far beyond the Oz gang, Bluebeard, and anybody else that we know so far. I also noticed this one small detail is that the granny from the first season is there, and because we're talking to her, I think this also suggests that she may know something big is going on with the Witch and Wizards, and she's kind of iffy on letting us know because of what we did to her in the first season. So I think seeing her multiple times, and she's even on the board herself, that even points more clearly towards the 13th floor. So that's kind of what I got about the story, the theories, and everything so far about Bigby, about The Wolf Among Us 2. I just think that we're gonna get a really cool fucking story, and I cannot wait to see what happens. I am so fucking excited. And so something else that I wanted to take a quick look at was an interview with IGN that just released as soon as the new trailer dropped. The CEO of Telltale gave some insight into why The Wolf Among Us 2 has taken so long to develop. And according to the interview given at IGN, the team was originally building the game using a combination of Telltale's internal technology and Unreal Engine 4. As development progressed, they realized that their existing setup wasn't going to support the game the way they wanted to. This led to a major technical reset and a transition to Unreal Engine 5. This change was so big in scale that it came with significant challenges. The team had to rebuild systems and adapt their workflow and basically reestablish their whole technical foundation. This resulted in a much slower development plan, and the project was pushed back much further than they originally anticipated. Now, my personal guess is that Telltale eventually realized they weren't going to hit their original target window, which was 2023, and the project was going to require a lot more work than they thought. So rather than continue providing updates and letting us know, hey, this is what we're gonna do, they just decided to kind of go quiet and focus on rebuilding the game and rebuilding all the technicalities of it. The goal was likely to avoid announcing anything that they thought would hurt the reputation more. So I think they just kind of went, like I said, quiet mode. The interview also addressed something really big that I was very curious to know about, which involved Ad Hoc Studio, Dispatch, because I love Ad Hoc. Ad Hoc became one of my favorite games of all time as well. Yeah, obviously Ad Hoc, before they went on to do Dispatch, they had actually written the script for The Wolf Among Us 2 and they were working on that. So this, addresses some of that partnership. The interview stated that some fans had been concerned when it was revealed that the partnership with Ad Hoc had ended. But apparently Telltale has said that the separation wasn't a result of creative disagreements or any problems that they had internally. Instead, the explanation that he gave was that Telltale knew they wouldn't be releasing a game for quite some time, and Ad Hoc wanted to go and pursue their own game. And rather than have them tied to a project that was still years away, they decided to mutually end their partnership and move forward independently. From everything that Telltale has said, the split appears to have been a business decision rather than anything else like drama that maybe was going on behind the scenes. Telltale also stated that according to them, many of the people at Ad Hoc have been working together for over a decade and have long wanted to develop and release their own games. Now, during the period when The Wolf Among Us 2 was kind of paused due to the whole technical reset that they were doing, Ad Hoc moved forward with its project Dispatch. And by the time that Telltale was ready to resume full production and work on The Wolf Among Us 2, Ad Hoc was already committed to its own work, its own video game. And at that point, bringing the studio back into a project no longer made practical sense. Now, one of the most interesting questions from the interview focused on how much of Ad Hoc's work remains in the final game. Now, when asked about this, the Telltale CEO explained that the project underwent a complete reset. The reset wasn't just limited to technology, it also affected the creative side of development. They were careful to point out that the game was always a collaborative effort. It was never a case of this is Ad Hoc's version and this is Telltale's version. The response they gave was that some elements from earlier versions of the game remain, but The Wolf Among Us 2 had ultimately become an entirely new project. At the same time, Telltale still has team members who have been working on the game since the inception of The Wolf Among Us 2, and they've had been working on it all the way till now. So they do have that continuity throughout the, long development process that they've been in. Telltale also acknowledged that these questions are becoming more common because of the success of Ad Hoc and, how massive Dispatch was. Telltale said that rather than viewing Dispatch success negatively, they are actually happy for Ad Hoc and want the team to have success and do the things they set out to accomplish, because their focus remains on being good stewards for The Wolf Among Us and delivering a game that respects both the series and its fans. So Telltale briefly discussed the future of the franchise and how they want to also make more The Wolf Among Us, and they would love to have The Wolf Among Us Season 3 someday. However, their current plan is to choose their next game this year, and then after The Wolf Among Us 2 releases, rather than jumping into a Wolf Among Us 3, they want some creative breathing room. So they basically want to do The Wolf Among Us 2, a new Telltale game, and then return potentially to The Wolf Among Us 3. This is obviously great and fantastic news for a lot of fans because it suggests that Telltale wants to see The Wolf Among Us as a long-term franchise rather than, a one-off return. If The Wolf Among Us 2 is successful, and I really think it will be, there is already interest within the studio with continuing the story. But if I'm being honest with you, and I have to be honest with you, I'd love to see The Wolf Among Us 2 release and then have Telltale move into The Wolf Among Us 3 right after that. And the reason I say that is because waiting so long for a fucking sequel is what scares me the most, is what worries me. I mean, what if something happens and their shift to a new project delays the return of The Wolf Among Us 2 because that project got delayed and they couldn't figure something out with a developer or with their partners. And then that shit gets pushed back years and years. So then it takes a lot longer for us to get into The Wolf Among Us 3. So that really does kind of scare me. That's basically everything that we have, and kind of everything that I wanted to share with you guys today. Before The Wolf Among Us 2 releases in 2027, we will be covering The Wolf Among Us Remastered once it releases. We are going to be updating my full story review using all brand new footage, and I'm really excited to do that. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be out later this year. And if you don't want to wait for that, you can go check out my full The Wolf Among Us story video explained, which is already live. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.